when we talk about resilience and particularly governance and the role of governance and how strengthening governance can help in really better outcomes in terms of resilience, one thing that we need to keep in mind is that resilience is a very complex issue that addresses very complex and diverse issues, and also should be collaborative efforts that brings different stakeholders together. So basically, when you're looking at that and looking at governance and how it plays, it feels to me that we can really discern the role of different entities in this. And when we talk about governance, our thinking goes to government, whether it is central, local, but I think that it brings also the role of other entities such as NGOs that work on this. It brings also the role of private sector, the role of the donor community. So I wanted just to make a couple of points and trying to really articulate what I think could be the role of each of these players, what role that they could eventually play in terms of really strengthening the governance. For me, when you talk about governance, you're talking about accountability, you're talking about information, access to information, you're talking also about participation as well, so which are critical elements to having, not only, but some of critical. So it feels to me that one really important information around building resilience is really role is being able to have information, to be able really to anticipate, but also have plans and scenarios that would allow to swiftly react in the face of uncertainty. So one point that then, therefore, that sounds to me very important is and which we lack in the resilience community is data and information. So for me, one role that government has is really organizing a system that allows to collect meaningful and important data, to be able to organize this data, but also to make sure that different actors have access to this, so that they can analyze, inform, have more knowledge, and be able to build scenarios. One other thing that seems to me also quite important is the planning, because all these aspects of anticipation goes with effective planning, having plans. But a plan is not enough. It tells you scenarios, what you could do in face of a shock, but really having the capacity to actually execute, that operational capacity to execute when a disaster or something happens is also very important. But for that, it means that we need also to have in governments, whether it is local or central, leaders also that are savvy, that understands and are committed to this framing of resilience and make decisions, make priorities based on this framework. And finally, one more point I thought was quite important as well in terms of governance is also ensuring that there is public participation in terms of really deciding what do you build resilience to, and whose resilience do you have to build, and how public participate in that, in terms of really exploring what potential solutions are through their implementation, but also the measurement of those impacts. And finally, one more point I wanted to add there, also the issue of accountability. Oftentimes, I think it is really important, and that speaks to the ensuring participation is really how this government can be really accountable to the people downwards. On specific outcomes around that, and investing and prioritizing that, and making that happen. I wanted also to touch a bit about NGOs, because we NGOs work a lot with communities that are vulnerable communities, try to have transformative impact in their lives in terms of really empowering, etc. So for me, and from my experience working in NGOs, is really how we can better manage and govern our programs in terms of really integrating them more, so that we are not having long-term oriented programming in one area, for instance, just as an example, and when actually crisis and shocks calls our intervention in a different area. So that poses really a problem of over time building capacity, but also pooling resources that make them more effective in how we. And again, I think that the issue of accountability downwards speaks also to this actor as well, how you are pursuing outcomes that matters to the people you are whose resilience you are building. I wanted also to touch a bit on the role of private sector, because private sector, particularly in the agro industry, most of them really depend on communities to source for their businesses. And oftentimes you would find that these communities are the most vulnerable and the most poor. We know that private sector mission is really to create value for their shareholders. But what could be a role in terms of really investing in those communities to build more income, more ability to accumulate assets, that these communities that oftentimes are being impoverished be able actually to have something to bounce back on, to actually count on in terms of in shocks. It feels to me like it's not just a moral thing, but for me it is more a business sense in terms of really sustaining these value chains. And finally, the last point I wanted to touch on is really also donor community. Which I think also has really a very important role in terms of really bridging the gap between humanitarian and long-term development. Because we are saying it's not really a matter of having like separate funds for resilience, but it's really bringing these two different entities together in terms of how they can be managed. Let me just ask one last point, is bringing an example on how also the capacity of anticipating and pooling really resources and risk can be important. One example I wanted to mention is the Africa risk capacity, on which actually the Rockefeller Foundation works with WFP and the African Union. The Africa risk capacity is really bringing three critical elements to governments, actually to avoid budget disruptions when actually they are faced with a crisis. It's the critical elements of early warning. It's also insurance based on weather index, but also contingency planning and effective operational response. And it takes governments, for instance, to take a premium to be able to have not just access to information and tools for planning, but also to be able to have mobilizable resources that allow them to swiftly actually intervene in the face of a crisis. So let me leave it there in terms of what different actors could do in terms of really strengthening the governance system in building resilience.